I knew the warp wanted me the moment the lights bowed. My name is Captain Hadrian Voss, Master and Commander of the Enduring Resolve, a dictator-class cruiser that has served the God Emperor's will for 732 years, though I have held her helm for only the last 18. I am the 9th captain to bear her command throne, the 9th to swear the oath of void upon her bridge. And before this voyage, I believed I would die in void combat as my predecessors had cleanly, with honor, my name inscribed in the ship's chapel alongside theirs. I had led her through the Varus Sector rebellion, stood unbroken when Xenos corsairs tried to board her during the cleansing of Talassar Prime, and I wore the seal of Solar Command on my breast as proof that I understood discipline, duty, and the weight of 6,000 souls depending on my judgment. The warp has shown me that pride is a currency it accepts as readily as fear. We had been traveling the Mandeville route from Cypra Mundi to the Forge world of Metallica, a journey we had made 11 times in my tenure without incident, carrying munitions and raw adamantium in our holds, and a cohort of Militarum reinforcements in the troop bays. The route was stable, blessed by navigators for 3 centuries, marked by beacons that sang their location hymns through the Imperium with the reliable cadence of a heartbeat. Our navigator, Cassia Orventhal, bore the seal of the Navis Nobilite, and had guided ships through far more treacherous passages. She sat in her spire with confidence that bordered on arrogance, her third eye wrapped in sanctified silk, her voice calm when she described the currents we would ride. I trusted her. I trusted the route. I trusted the enduring resolve and the machine spirits that had carried her through centuries of service. Trust, I have learned, is another offering the warp will take from you. The ship was a city of metal and prayer, 17 decks stacked vertically like the layers of a hive, each one a world unto itself with its own rhythms and populations. The upper decks held the bridge and command centers, spaces lit by steady lumen globes where officers moved with practiced efficiency and servitors clicked through their programmed routines. The air there smelled of parchment and recaf, and the ozone tang of active cogitator banks. Mid-decks housed the crew quarters and training halls and mess chambers where 6,000 men and women ate their rations and spoke in the clipped, functional language of those who knew their lives depended on their neighbors. Those corridors rang with boot steps and the low hum of ventilation systems, and the walls were lined with devotional alcoves where candles burned before icons of the Emperor. The lower decks belonged to the engines and the mechanicus engineers who tended them, spaces so loud with machinery that speech was impossible, where heat rose in shimmering waves and the air tasted of promethium and sacred oils. Down there the ship ceased to be a vessel and became a living organism of pistons and turbines and plasma reactors that churned with terrible purpose. I walked those corridors every day, making inspections that were equal parts ritual and necessity, showing my face to the crew so they remembered that command was present and watchful. I would descend from the bridge at the start of third shift, accompanied by my adjutant, Lieutenant Cale Morvan, and a detail of armsmen, and we would move through the decks with deliberate visibility. I watched the crew for signs of disorder or fatigue, listened to the quality of their voices when they saluted, observed whether their uniforms were maintained and their weapons properly sanctified. Morvan kept notes on a data slate, marking minor infractions and commendations, but mostly we simply walked and let ourselves be seen. The crew needed to know that I breathed the same recycled air they did, that I heard the same thrumming of the engines, that I was as bound to the enduring resolve as they were. In the Navis Imperialis we are taught that a captain is not merely a commander but a priest of sorts, the highest servant of the ship's soul, and I took that duty seriously. The Geller field generators occupied a shrine chamber on Deck 9, a space kept in perpetual low light where Tech Priest Explorator Vin Sigma 47 and his subordinates maintained the mechanisms that kept the warp from touching us. I visited that chamber more than any other, drawn by a superstition I never spoke aloud, standing before the humming pylons while Vin Sigma performed his binary prayers and anointed connection points with sacred unguents. The Geller field was our shell, our protection, the skin that separated the materium from the immaterium. Without it, we would dissolve into the warp's madness within seconds, every soul aboard devoured or worse. I would watch the field indicators and listen to the steady pulse of the generators and feel a cold certainty in my gut that this was where any voyage lived or died. Vin Sigma tolerated my presence with the distant courtesy the Mechanicus shows to unaugmented humans, and sometimes he would pause in his rituals to speak to me in low Gothic, explaining some minor adjustment or efficiency improvement in language I only half understood. I think he appreciated that I cared. I think he knew I was afraid. The bridge was my throne room and my prison, a vaulted space at the cruiser's prow where command thrones and tactical stations formed concentric rings around my seat at the center. Stained glass windows 50 feet tall depicted the Emperor ascending, their colored panes casting amber and crimson light across the deck, and beneath them stood statues of previous captains in full dress uniform, their stone eyes watching every decision I made. I sat in the command throne for 16 hours of every cycle, reviewing reports and issuing orders and listening to the constant stream of vox chatter that flowed through the ship like blood through veins. My officers surrounded me, Morven at the tactical station, Master Helmsman Torvus at the navigation console, Bosun Harrick coordinating deck operations, Astropath Kane in his shielded alcove, sending and receiving messages from distant worlds. We were professionals. We were efficient. We moved through our duties with the precision of a machine, and I believed that precision would protect us. The first disturbance came 3 days into the voyage, so subtle that I nearly dismissed it. I was on the bridge reviewing munitions manifests when the lumen strips along the port bulkhead flickered, a brief dimming that lasted perhaps 2 seconds before returning to normal illumination. No alarms sounded. No servitors registered anomalies. I glanced up from the data slate and saw Morven frowning at the same bulkhead, his hand hovering near the vox bead in his ear, as if expecting a damage report that never came. Torvus didn't notice at all. His attention remained fixed on the navigation plot, his augmetic eyes tracking the ship's position relative to the Mandeville corridor. The flicker passed. I returned to the manifests. But something in my gut tightened, a sensation like cold water trickling down my spine, and I found myself staring at the bulkhead long after the lights had stabilized. "Run a diagnostic on the port power grid," I said, keeping my voice level. "Standard procedure. Log any irregularities." Morven nodded and relayed the order to the engineering decks. 20 minutes later, the report came back. All systems optimal, no fluctuations detected, no explanation for the flicker. I read the report twice, then filed it, and forced myself to move on to other duties. Ships have quirks. The Enduring Resolve was old, her systems layered with centuries of repairs and modifications, and occasionally machine spirits required appeasement or minor rituals to maintain harmony. A single flicker meant nothing. I told myself this, and I almost believed it. The second disturbance came 6 hours later during evening prayer, and this time I could not dismiss it. The ship's chapels held services at prescribed hours, and though my duties often prevented attendance, I made a point of joining the crew when I could. It was good for morale, and privately I found comfort in the liturgies, the familiar cadences that connected us to a billion other faithful across the Imperium. I stood in the main chapel on Deck 4, surrounded by 300 crew members whose voices rose in the hymn of solar devotion, and I let my own voice join theirs, feeling the words resonate in my chest. The chapel was beautiful in its severity, all dark wood and polished brass, with candles burning before a bronze aquila 20 feet tall. Incense hung thick in the air, the sacred resins making my eyes water, and for a moment I felt at peace. Then the candles bent, not flickered, bent. Every flame in the chapel leaned simultaneously to starboard, as if blown by a wind that did not exist, and held that position for 3 full seconds before returning upright. The hymn faltered. Voices died mid-word. 300 faces turned toward the candles with expressions that ranged from confusion to naked fear, and I felt my own breath catch in my throat because I had seen that phenomenon once before, in a briefing on warp incursions, in pick captures taken from ships that had lost Geller field integrity, flames bending toward something, flames bowing to a presence that should not exist in real space. I forced my voice steady and continued the hymn alone, and after a moment the crew joined me, their voices uncertain but growing stronger. We finished the service. I gave the benediction. I dismissed them calmly, as if nothing had happened, and then I strode from the chapel with Morven at my heels and took the nearest lift directly to Deck 9. Vin Sigma met me at the entrance to the Geller field chamber, his mechadendrites writhing with agitation. binary code streaming from his Vox speakers in bursts I couldn't parse. I didn't need translation to know something was wrong. The chamber's lighting had shifted from the usual dim amber to a pulsing red, and the pylons hummed with a frequency that made my teeth ache. The field indicators showed integrity at 97%, well within acceptable parameters, but the tech priest's posture radiated distress. "Report," I said. "Fluctuation detected at 1700 hours and 42 minutes, Vin Sigma replied, his Gothic flat and mechanical. "Duration, 3.7 seconds. Intensity, negligible. Cause, unknown. Field integrity restored immediately. Probability of catastrophic failure, 0.03%. 0.03, I repeated. That's not zero." "Correct." I stared at the pylons, watching the faint blue corona that danced around their surfaces, the visible manifestation of the barrier between us and the warp. 3.7 seconds, the exact duration the candles had bowed. My mouth tasted of metal. "Can you determine the source of the fluctuation?" "Negative. Warp currents show no anomalies. Navigation route is stable. Geller field generators are performing optimally. Fluctuation appears spontaneous. Nothing in the warp is spontaneous." Vin Sigma's mechadendrites stilled. His optical implants focused on me with an intensity that felt uncomfortably close to human concern. "Correct." I left him to his ministrations and returned to the bridge, my mind churning through possibilities I didn't want to name. Spontaneous fluctuations didn't exist. The warp responded to reality, to emotion and thought, and the presence of souls. But it required a catalyst, a damaged field, a corrupted navigator, a psychic event. We had none of those things. Our field was strong. Cassia sat in her spire, serene and confident. The astropathic choir showed no signs of distress. Yet something had touched us. Something had made the lights bow and the flames bend. Something had noticed us. I walked the corridors after that, leaving Morven on the bridge with orders to summon me if anything appeared irregular. I moved through the decks alone, my boots echoing on metal floors, my eyes scanning every surface for signs of wrongness. The ship felt different. I couldn't articulate how, couldn't point to a specific detail that had changed, but the sensation pressed against my awareness like a hand on the back of my neck. Corridors seemed longer. Shadows fell at angles that didn't match the lumen strips. Ventilation grates whispered with rhythms that almost sounded like speech. I told myself I was imagining it, that fear was painting patterns onto randomness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the enduring resolve was no longer entirely mine to command. On Deck 7, I passed a maintenance crew replacing a section of damaged conduit, and I stopped to watch them work. They moved with their usual efficiency, welding new pipe segments and chanting the litany of proper function as they sealed connections, but their voices sounded hollow, and I saw one of them glance over his shoulder 3 times in as many minutes as if checking for something behind him. When I asked if there was a problem, he shook his head too quickly, his eyes not quite meeting mine, and I let it pass because I had no evidence of anything wrong. But I logged it. I logged everything now. The silence bothered me most. The ship was never truly quiet. Engines thrummed, ventilation hummed, thousands of crew members moved and spoke and worked, but beneath those sounds I had always heard a deeper resonance, a sense of presence that I attributed to the machine spirits, or perhaps to my own familiarity with the vessel. That resonance was changing. It felt stretched, somehow, like a voice speaking from too far away, and in the pauses between sounds I heard something else, a faint high-pitched tone that might have been tinnitus, except that it came from outside my skull. I stood in an empty corridor on Deck 12 and listened to that tone for 5 minutes, trying to determine its source, and I realized it was coming from everywhere and nowhere, woven into the fabric of the ship itself. I walked those corridors, and they did not obey me anymore. The thought came unbidden, and I tried to dismiss it as exhaustion or stress, but it settled into my mind with the weight of truth. The enduring resolve had been my ship, my responsibility, an extension of my will given form in metal and plasma, and I had known her as intimately as I knew my own body. Now she felt foreign. The distances between sections seemed inconsistent. Bulkheads appeared in places I didn't remember them. Doorways led to chambers whose layouts didn't quite match my mental map. Small things, subtle things. Things I could rationalize individually, but that accumulated into a pattern I couldn't ignore. I returned to my quarters at the start of 4th shift and stood before the small shrine I kept there, a modest icon of the Emperor flanked by candles and a worn copy of the Tactica Imperialis. I knelt, I prayed. I spoke the words of the devotional of guidance and asked for clarity, for strength, for the wisdom to protect my crew from whatever darkness was unfolding around us. The candles burned straight and true. No answer came. I had not expected one, but some desperate part of me had hoped, and the silence felt like condemnation. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my desk and reviewed every report from every department, searching for patterns in power consumption and crew rotations and minor equipment failures. I found nothing definitive, only a vague sense that small irregularities were increasing in frequency. A servitor that repeated its task 3 times instead of once, a Vox channel that picked up static where none should exist, a pressure seal that failed its inspection despite being newly installed. Each incident had a rational explanation. Taken together, they formed a mosaic of wrongness that made my hands shake. At dawn, I returned to the bridge and found Cassia waiting for me, her tall frame wrapped in the midnight robes of the Navis Nobilite, her third eye still bound in silk, but somehow I could feel it watching me anyway. She stood before the command throne without having been summoned, and her face held an expression I had never seen on her before. Uncertainty. "Captain," she said, and her voice carried none of its usual arrogance. "I need to speak with you, privately." We descended to her spire, a chamber at the ship's highest point, where she sat enthroned amid navigation equipment and sacred charts that mapped the warp's currents. The room smelled of parchment and something else, something organic and wrong that I couldn't name. She sealed the door behind us and stood with her back to me for a long moment, her hands trembling. "The route has changed," she said finally. "Changed how?" "I don't know. The beacons are still there, the currents are stable, but the warp itself feels different, as if we're being watched by something vast and patient, something that has always been watching but has only now decided to acknowledge us. I see patterns in the Imperium that shouldn't exist, geometries that fold in on themselves, colors that don't belong in any spectrum I was taught to read. It's subtle, so subtle I questioned my own sanity for 2 days before coming to you. But it's real." I felt cold settle into my bones. "Can you still navigate?" "Yes, for now. But Captain, if something in the warp has taken an interest in us, navigation may become irrelevant. We could follow every beacon perfectly and still end up somewhere we were never meant to be. What do you recommend?" She turned to face me, and I saw fear naked in her human eyes. "Prayer." I left her there and returned to the bridge with her words echoing in my skull. The warp wanted us. Something vast and patient had noticed the enduring resolve, had reached out with invisible fingers and touched our Geller field, had made flames bow and corridors stretch and filled our navigator with dread. I sat in my command throne and stared at the stained glass Emperor and wondered if this was how it began for all the ships that vanished into the warp's depths. The thousands of vessels that simply never arrived at their destinations, their crews lost to madness or worse. I wondered if my name would be inscribed in the chapel after all, or if the enduring resolve would simply cease to exist, erased from Imperial records as if we had never sailed. The lights flickered again, and this time they stayed dim for 10 seconds before returning. I gave no orders. I made no announcements. I sat in my throne and watched my crew continue their duties, and I knew with terrible certainty that this was only the beginning. The Geller field began to pulse on the 4th day, and with it the ship started to dream. I felt it first as a rhythm in the deck plating, a subtle vibration that rose and fell with the slow cadence of breath, and I knew immediately that something fundamental had changed because the enduring resolve had never breathed before. Ships are static things, their machinery running in steady cycles that produce constant background noise, and any deviation from that constancy signals malfunction or damage. But this was neither. This was organic. This was intentional. I stood in the corridor outside my quarters with my palm pressed flat against the bulkhead and felt the pulse move through the metal like a heartbeat, and I understood in that moment that we were no longer traveling through the warp, but being digested by it. Vin Sigma's reports confirmed what my instincts already knew. The Geller field integrity was oscillating between 92 and 98%, never failing but never stable, pulsing in a pattern that matched the vibrations I felt through the deck. He showed me data screens filled with graphs and probability matrices, his mechanical voice describing harmonic resonances and waveform interference, but beneath the technical language, I heard genuine confusion. The field was behaving in ways his protocols couldn't account for, as if something outside was pushing against it in rhythm, testing its strength not to break through but to learn its contours. "Recommendation?" I asked. "Increase power allocation to field generators by 7.3%. Reinforce prayer rituals. Monitor continuously. Will that stop the oscillation?" His mechadendrites coiled tight against his robes. "Unknown." I authorized the power increase and ordered round-the-clock observation of the Geller chamber, rotating tech priests and engine seers through shifts to ensure continuous oversight. Then, I did what I should have done days earlier. I summoned my senior officers to the strategium and told them the truth. They sat around the brass table in silence as I described the fluctuations, the navigator's concerns, the growing sense that we were being observed by something in the warp. Morven took notes. Bosun Harrick's face remained impassive. Master Helmsman Torvus's augmetic eyes clicked through focusing adjustments. Only Astropath Kane reacted visibly, his withered body shuddering inside his robes, his empty eye sockets weeping tears he couldn't see. "Can you reach other ships?" I asked him. "Send distress signals? Request assistance?" "I have been trying, Lord Captain," he whispered, his voice like wind through dead leaves. "The warp is full of whispers now. I send my messages and they return to me changed, twisted into phrases I did not write. I hear other astropaths screaming in languages that predate the Imperium. Something is listening to every thought I project, and it is answering in ways I do not understand. Cease all astropathic transmission," I ordered. "We draw no more attention than we already have." He nodded, relief and shame mingling on his ancient face. "Recommendations for crew management?" I asked the table. Harrick cleared his throat. "Maintain routine, keep them busy. Fear spreads fastest in idle minds. Double the prayer services and increase rations if supplies allow. Make them feel we have control." "Do we?" No one answered. I dismissed them and sat alone in the strategium, staring at the tactical hololith that displayed our ship as a small green rune moving through the vastness of the warp. The rune flickered occasionally, its position uncertain, and I watched it for an hour trying to convince myself that we were still proceeding toward Metallica. The display meant nothing now. We could be anywhere. We could be nowhere. The warp did not follow rules of distance or direction, and I had no way to verify our true position except Cassia's increasingly uncertain reports. The corridors changed more overtly after that, and I stopped trying to pretend otherwise. I would walk from the bridge to engineering and find that the route required 2 additional turns I didn't remember, or that a corridor I had traversed 1,000 times now sloped downward when it should have been level. Doorways appeared where solid bulkheads had stood yesterday. Alcoves that once held devotional icons now opened onto storage chambers I had never authorized. The crew noticed too. I saw them hesitate at intersections, checking corridor markings twice, muttering prayers as they navigated their own ship. Some began marking their routes with chalk or leaving equipment at key junctions as landmarks, primitive wayfinding techniques that would have been laughable a week ago but now seemed like wisdom. The lighting became unreliable, lumen strips flickering in sequences that almost resembled patterns, and in the moments of dimness I saw colors that shouldn't exist in real space, iridescent blues and purples that shimmered at the edges of vision and vanished when I looked directly at them. I ordered full spectrum lighting analysis and received reports that confirmed the light frequencies were within normal parameters. Yet still, I saw those impossible hues, and I knew my officers saw them too because I caught them staring at the same spots I did, their faces troubled. The crew began to fracture along invisible fault lines, bonds of camaraderie giving way to suspicion and paranoia. Minor disputes escalated into shouting matches. Work crews that had functioned smoothly for years now bickered over trivial matters. I heard reports of physical altercations on the lower decks, nothing serious but increasing in frequency, and I authorized the armsmen to increase patrols and impose harsh discipline on anyone who violated ship protocol. It was crude medicine, rule through intimidation, but it was all I had. The machine spirits turned erratic. Equipment that had operated flawlessly for centuries now required constant appeasement and ritual maintenance. A plasma conduit on Deck 6 failed 3 times in one day despite being blessed and rededicated after each failure. A cargo lift began moving between decks without being summoned, its machine spirit apparently deciding for itself where it needed to be. Servitors occasionally froze mid-task, their augmetic components locked in place while their organic parts twitched and whimpered. Vin Sigma performed emergency maintenance constantly. His subordinates spread across the ship, attempting to calm rebellious machinery, and I saw the strain in his posture, the way his movements became more frantic even as his voice remained monotone. I found him in the engineering cathedral on Deck 14, standing before the primary plasma reactor with his mechadendrites extended toward it like a priest in supplication, binary code flowing from him in a continuous stream that sounded like prayer or pleading. The reactor rumbled with a deeper pitch than usual, its containment field glowing with swirls of purple that definitely did not belong there, and I watched Vin Sigma commune with it for 10 minutes before he noticed my presence. "The machine spirits are confused," he said without turning. "They sense wrongness in the ship's systems but cannot identify the source. They reach for guidance and find only static. Some are becoming afraid. Machines don't feel fear. A common misconception. Machine spirits possess a spectrum of responses analogous to emotion. Fear is among them." He finally turned to face me, and I saw something in his optical implants that looked almost like sympathy. "Captain, we must consider the possibility that the enduring resolve is no longer entirely a ship." "Explain." "The warp is changing us. Not just distorting physical space, but rewriting the fundamental nature of our reality. The longer we remain here, the more the distinction between ship and warp becomes meaningless. We may be transitioning from vessel to something else, a hybrid entity, part Materium, part Immaterium. If that process completes, we will not be able to return to real space, even if we find our way out." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that his sensors were malfunctioning, that the Omnissiah would protect his faithful servants from such corruption. Instead, I asked, "How long do we have?" "Unknown. Days, weeks, hours. The warp does not respect linear time." I left him there and ascended to the observation gallery on Deck 2, a chamber with reinforced viewports that looked out into the warp through the Gellerfield's protective barrier. Normally I avoided this place, staring into the warp-invited madness, but I needed to see what we were traveling through, needed to understand what was consuming us. The warp churned outside the viewports like a sea of living thought, impossible colors and geometries writhing in patterns that hurt to perceive. I forced myself to look anyway, my eyes watering as I tried to make sense of shapes that existed in too many dimensions. And there, barely visible against the chaos, I saw structures that resembled eyes, not literal eyes, but suggestions of watchfulness, concentrations of attention that swirled through the warp storm and seemed to focus on our ship. Dozens of them, hundreds, all watching with patient curiosity, as if we were an experiment being conducted by something vast beyond comprehension. I turned away before my sanity fractured and found 3 crew members standing behind me, their faces slack, their eyes reflecting the warp colors. They stared at the viewports without blinking, and when I ordered them to return to their posts, they didn't respond. I had to physically shake them before they snapped out of their fugue, and even then they moved like sleepwalkers, their gazes distant. "Seal this gallery," I told Morven when I returned to the bridge. "Post guards. No one enters without my direct authorization." "Sir, if the crew learns we're restricting access, they're already afraid. This will at least give them something concrete to fear instead of shadows." He saluted and implemented the order, and I sat in my command throne wondering how long I could maintain the illusion of control before the crew realized their captain was as lost as they were. The first vision came that night, and I knew immediately that it was not a dream. I was in my quarters, attempting sleep that refused to come, when the walls began to breathe. Not figuratively, they literally expanded and contracted, the metal bulkheads flexing like living tissue, and I sat up in my cot, watching this impossibility with a calm that should have terrified me more than the vision itself. The breathing accelerated, grew rhythmic, and then the walls split open along seams I hadn't known existed, peeling back to reveal a space beyond that was not corridor or void, but something else entirely. Feathers, thousands of them, millions. A vast chamber filled floor to ceiling with feathers that shimmered with all the colors I had seen at the edges of the lighting. Iridescent blues and purples and shades that had no names. They drifted through the air without gravity, tumbling and spinning in currents I couldn't feel, and each feather seemed to carry awareness, seemed to be watching me with attention that was both focused and diffuse. I reached toward them, and they retreated, maintaining precise distance. And I understood with dream logic certainty that they were examining me, cataloging every aspect of my being, my thoughts, my fears, my pride in having commanded the enduring resolve, my desperate need to protect my crew. They wanted something from me. They wanted me. Not my body or my soul, but my purpose, my duty, the thing that defined me as a captain and a servant of the Imperium. Then the feathers parted, and I saw eyes. Not physical eyes, but holes in reality through which something looked at me from outside existence. 9 eyes arranged in a pattern that suggested meaning I couldn't decipher, each one fixed on me with such intensity that I felt flayed, every secret and private thought exposed to judgment. I wanted to look away but couldn't, wanted to scream but had no voice. And in that paralysis I heard words that were not words, concepts that bypassed language and imprinted directly into my mind. We see you. We have always seen you. You are a pattern worth preserving. I woke gasping, my body drenched in sweat, my quarters unchanged except for a single detail. On the wall above my shrine, where there had been nothing but blank metal, someone had scratched 9 circles arranged in the same pattern as the eyes. I stared at those circles for an hour, then ordered them welded over and never spoke of them to anyone. Time stopped being reliable on the 9th day, or perhaps it was the 12th, or perhaps no time had passed at all, and I was simply perceiving duration in a reality where the concept had lost meaning. I tried to maintain the ship's chronology through duty rosters and shift changes, through the ritual of morning prayers and evening benedictions, but the crew began reporting inconsistencies that couldn't be dismissed. A watch that should have lasted 4 hours stretched to 8, according to the chronometers, but felt like 20 minutes to those who worked it. A maintenance detail spent what they swore was 30 minutes repairing a ventilation system, only to discover 6 hours had elapsed. Crew members arrived for shifts they had completed yesterday or hadn't been assigned yet or didn't remember receiving orders to perform. The ship's central chronometer continued its steady march forward, but individual timepieces diverged wildly, running fast or slow or simply stopping, and we lost the ability to synchronize our movements across the vessel. I ordered all crew to report directly to their superiors at regular intervals and mark their attendance manually, a primitive system that at least gave us the illusion of structure. But even that failed when officers began noting that subordinates reported twice for the same shift or missed entire duty cycles without realizing time had passed. I found myself questioning my own memories. Had I already inspected Deck 7 today? Had I slept in the last 20 hours? Had I given certain orders or merely intended to give them? My data slate held notes in my own handwriting that I didn't remember making. Cassia descended from her spire looking decades older, her hair turned partially white, her hands shaking with fine tremors. She would not tell me what she had seen in the warp, but insisted that navigation was still possible, that we were still moving toward something, even if that something was no longer Metallica. I didn't press her. I needed her functional more than I needed honesty. The disappearances began subtly, so gradual that I didn't notice the pattern until we were dozens of crew short. A servitor would be sent to deliver supplies and never arrive. A maintenance team would report to a malfunctioning system and simply not return. Individual crew members would step into a corridor and vanish, their comrades watching them go around a corner and then finding empty passages when they followed. At first, we attributed it to confusion, to the warped corridors and unreliable time leading people to different locations than intended, but the numbers grew too large to dismiss. 53 souls missing by my count, though when I checked the rosters, some of them had apparently never been assigned to the ship at all. Their names absent from crew logs I knew they should have appeared in. I found one of them on Deck 10, a junior rating named Callus, who had been missing for 2 days according to his squad leader, but who claimed he had just left the mess hall 5 minutes ago. He stood in the center of a corridor repeating the litany of protection, his voice steady but his eyes wrong too wide, too focused on something I couldn't see. When I questioned him, he answered clearly, describing his duties and movements with perfect accuracy. but he kept insisting it was morning when every chronometer said afternoon, and when I asked him to follow me back to his quarters, he walked 3 steps and vanished. Not into a doorway, not around a corner, simply ceased existing between one step and the next, and I was left standing in an empty corridor with my arms still extended toward where he had been. I ordered armsmen to escort everyone in pairs, to never allow crew to move through the ship alone. But even that failed when entire pairs vanished together, their vox beads going silent mid-conversation, their last known positions showing only empty chambers. The crew who remained began to change in ways that were harder to quantify than disappearances. Some grew quiet, spending their off-shift hours in the chapels, praying silently for hours until they had to be forcibly removed to resume their duties. Others became manic, working double and triple shifts without sleep, their eyes bright with fevered energy that made them more dangerous than useful. A rating in the munitions bay began arranging shells in complex geometric patterns during his breaks, patterns he couldn't explain but insisted were important, and when I had the patterns photographed and destroyed, he wept as if I had killed something precious. An officer started speaking in binary code without realizing it, carrying on half her conversations in machine language that only the tech priests could understand, and she seemed genuinely confused when I ordered her to medical. The ship's chapel became a place of strange pilgrimages. I found crew members kneeling before the Aquila at odd hours, their lips moving in prayers that didn't quite match any approved liturgy, their hands tracing symbols in the air that I recognized from forbidden texts I had seen during my training. When questioned, they claimed to be following proper devotional protocol, and perhaps they believed that, but I saw the wrongness in their eyes, the sense that they were worshipping something that wore the Emperor's face but was not him. I increased security around the chapels, placed armsmen to observe the faithful and report any heretical behavior, but the armsmen themselves were not immune. I caught one of them scratching symbols into his armor plating with a knife, the same 9-circle pattern I had seen above my shrine, and when I demanded to know where he had learned that design, he looked at me with genuine confusion and said he thought I had ordered it, that it was part of our ship's insignia. It wasn't. It never had been. But when I inspected other armsmen, I found a third of them had carved similar patterns into their equipment, and none of them could explain why. The navigator finally broke on what the chronometer claimed was day 14. I was on the bridge when her screaming echoed through the Vox system, raw and primal, and I ran to her spire, taking steps 3 at a time. The door had sealed itself, the locking mechanisms refusing my command codes, and I could hear her shrieking inside about eyes and patterns and truths that broke minds. Vin Sigma arrived with cutting equipment, and we breached the door to find her collapsed before her navigation throne, the silk binding around her third eye torn away, the eye itself open and staring at something in the empty air. Blood ran from her nose and ears, her hands clutched at her skull as if trying to hold it together. Words poured from her in a stream that mixed High Gothic and languages I didn't recognize, descriptions of geometries that folded through dimensions and colors that existed only in thought, and vast intelligences that observed humanity the way a scholar might observe bacteria in a culture. I tried to close her third eye, but it wouldn't obey, the warp sight frozen open, and I finally had to sedate her with enough narcotics to kill a normal human. She survived but remained catatonic, her third eye continuing to stare at nothing, and I knew we had lost our navigator. We were adrift now in truth, moving through the warp without guidance, our path determined by currents we couldn't read. I should have panicked. I should have despaired. Instead, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the acceptance that comes when circumstances exceed all possible preparation. We were lost. We had been lost since the moment the lights first bowed. Everything since then had been denial, a refusal to accept the inevitable. But now that truth stood naked before me, and I could finally see it clearly. The second vision came in the observation gallery, though I had sealed it and posted guards and ordered no one to enter. I found myself standing before the viewports without remembering walking there, the guards absent or perhaps never existed, the warp churning beyond the glass with hypnotic intensity. And I saw myself reflected in that chaos, not my physical body but my pattern, the shape my life had carved through reality. I saw every decision I had made as captain, every order given, every crew member saved or sacrificed, every moment of pride and fear and determination that had defined me. and I saw that pattern was beautiful in its complexity, a structure built from purpose and duty, and the unwavering belief that I could protect those under my command through sheer force of will. The warp wanted that pattern, not to destroy it but to preserve it, to take something so purely human and study it, understand it, add it to a vast library of patterns that existed beyond time and space. I was not being hunted, I was being curated. The feathers returned then, filling the observation gallery, and I didn't pull away when they touched my face, my hands, my chest. They felt like thought given substance, like consciousness brushing against consciousness, and in their touch I understood that the warp was not malicious toward us. It was curious. We had entered its realm and attracted the attention of something that existed to observe and catalogue and understand, and that thing had decided the enduring resolve and its crew represented a pattern worth investigating. We were not prey. We were a specimen. Show us. The feathers whispered without sound. Show us what duty means. Show us why you persist. Show us the shape of your purpose. I pushed them away and they swirled back into patterns that hurt to see. And when I blinked, the gallery was empty and the guards stood at their posts as if they had never left. And I knew I had lost minutes or hours or days to that vision. I returned to the bridge and found my officers waiting with reports of new strangeness. Entire sections of the ship now appeared in places they couldn't physically fit, as if the interior dimensions no longer matched the exterior hull. The engineering decks reported that the plasma reactor was burning with impossible efficiency, producing more power than physics allowed. The astropathic choir had begun humming in unison without consciously meaning to, a single note that resonated through the walls and made the air vibrate. "We're changing," I told them, speaking the truth I had been avoiding. "The ship is changing. We're changing. The warp is remaking us into something that can exist here, and I don't know if we can stop it or even if we should try." Morven's face went pale. "Sir, are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that survival may require accepting that we are no longer purely creatures of the Imperium. I'm suggesting that the distinction between ship and warp is becoming meaningless, and our choice is to resist and be destroyed or adapt and be transformed. That's heresy. That's reality." He stared at me with something between horror and betrayal, and I saw in his eyes that he understood I was right, that we had already crossed some invisible threshold and could never return to what we had been. The others remained silent, and I knew they understood too. I dismissed them and sat alone in my command throne, staring at the stained glass emperor whose eyes seemed to watch me with sadness or perhaps disappointment. I had failed. I had lost the ship, lost the crew, lost myself in ways I was only beginning to comprehend, but I was still captain. I still bore responsibility for every soul aboard, and if adaptation was our only path to survival, then I would guide that adaptation, would ensure that whatever we became, we retained enough humanity to remain loyal to the Imperium, to the Emperor, to the duty that had defined us. I walked the corridors one last time before making my decision, and they no longer obeyed any logic of architecture or physics. I found stairs that led upward and downward simultaneously, chambers that existed at the intersection of multiple decks, doorways that opened onto spaces I knew were outside the ship's hull. The crew I passed moved with the slow certainty of sleepwalkers, and some of them greeted me with words that came from mouths that no longer quite matched the shape of human speech. The enduring resolve was dying, and something new was being born from its corpse. I could fight that birth, or I could midwife it. I chose the latter, because a captain's duty is to his crew above all else, and if transformation was their only chance at survival, then I would transform with them. I descended to the Geller field chamber and found Vin Sigma waiting as if he had known I would come. The pylons no longer pulsed but sang, a clear crystalline tone that spoke of barriers dissolving, of protection giving way to acceptance. "We cannot maintain field integrity indefinitely," he said. "Power consumption is approaching critical thresholds. Recommendation: controlled shutdown. If we shut down the field, we dissolve into the warp within seconds. Correction: we merge with the warp within seconds. The distinction is significant. We may survive as patterns rather than flesh. You're suggesting we become daemons. I am suggesting we become something without precedent. The crew has already begun the transition. Resisting will only cause suffering. Guiding the transformation may preserve essential elements of identity and purpose. I looked at the pylons, at the flickering field that was all that stood between us and total dissolution, and I made my choice. Begin controlled reduction of field strength, 5% per hour, give the crew time to adapt. Acknowledged. I left him there and ascended to my quarters, sealing the door behind me, and I knelt before my shrine for what I knew would be the last time. I prayed not for salvation but for the strength to remain myself through whatever came next, for the clarity to guide my crew through transformation without losing the core of what made us loyal servants of the Imperium. I prayed that when we emerged, if we emerged, we would still remember our purpose, still serve the Emperor even in whatever form we wore. The shrine's candles bent toward me, and I let them. The Gellerfield sang its death song in frequencies that made reality shiver, and I stood on the bridge watching probability dissolve into certainty as the barrier between us and the warp grew thin as breath. 5% reduction. 10. 15. Vin Sigma's measured countdown echoed through the Vox system, his mechanical voice the only constant in a ship that had ceased following any rule except change. The crew felt it immediately. I saw it in their faces as I walked the decks in those final hours, the way their eyes unfocused and refocused on things that existed halfway between thought and matter, the way they moved through walls that had learned to be permeable, the way they spoke in overlapping voices that harmonized with frequencies only the warp could produce. They were afraid. They were transforming. They were becoming something for which no Imperial lexicon held adequate words. I gathered them in the main assembly hall on Deck 4, 6,000 souls packed into a space that somehow accommodated them all despite being far too small, and I spoke to them without Vox amplification because my voice now carried through the ship's structure itself, resonating in metal and air and the spaces between. "We are lost," I said, and the truth of it rang through the hall like a bell. "The warp has claimed us, drawn us into its depths, and we will not reach Metallica. We will not return to any port we know. What we were, what we are, is ending. But ending is not death. The Imperium teaches us that the Emperor protects, and I believe he does, even here, even in this darkness. We have served him faithfully. We have maintained our discipline and our devotion even as reality itself tried to unmake us. And now we face a choice. Resist the transformation and be destroyed, or accept it and become something new." 6,000 faces stared at me, and I saw understanding dawn in eyes that had begun to reflect colors that shouldn't exist. I cannot promise you will remain human in the way we understand humanity. I cannot promise we will remember our names or our histories when this is done. But I swear to you on the throne itself that I will guide us through this transformation with every particle of will I possess. That I will fight to preserve our purpose even if our form must change. That we will emerge from this still loyal to the Emperor and the Imperium we have served. Silence held the hall for 3 breaths. Then, orating in the back, began the litany of devotion, and the words spread through the assembly like fire through dry grass, 6,000 voices rising in prayer that shook the bulkheads and made the lumen strips flare with impossible brilliance. They trusted me. Emperor, forgive me. They still trusted me, and I felt the weight of that trust like chains binding me to a duty I could no longer fully comprehend. I dismissed them to their posts and returned to the bridge, where my officers waited with expressions that ranged from grim acceptance to barely controlled terror. Morven had aged a decade in days, his hair shot through with white, his hands trembling until he clasped them behind his back. Bosun Harrick stood rigid at attention, his face carved from stone, refusing to show weakness even as I saw the edges of him blur slightly, reality uncertain about his boundaries. Torvus's augmetic eyes clicked continuously, trying to focus on readings his organic brain couldn't process. "All stations report ready," Morven said quietly. "Field integrity at 63% and falling. Engineering reports stable power consumption. Casualties: 17 crew in medical with what the chirurgeons are calling perceptual fracturing. They're seeing through time, sir. Past and future simultaneously. Keep them sedated until the transformation is complete. Sir, there may not be anything to wake up to. Then they'll sleep through the end. That's mercy." He nodded and turned back to his console, and I saw him mutter a prayer so quiet I almost missed it. "Emperor, guide us into darkness." The Jella field reached 50% at what the chronometer insisted was hour 47 of the controlled shutdown, and that was when the ship's true metamorphosis began. The corridors breathed. Not with the subtle rhythm I had felt before, but with deep, deliberate expansion and contraction that made the metal groan and sing. Bulkheads flowed like liquid, reshaping themselves into geometries that hurt the mind to perceive, angles that pointed in directions that didn't exist in three-dimensional space. I walked through those corridors and felt them welcome me, felt the ship recognize my presence and adjust itself to accommodate my passage, doorways opening before I reached them and sealing behind me with the gentleness of a hand closing around a fragile thing. The machine spirits stopped being spirits and became present in ways that terrified and awed me. I entered the engineering cathedral and found the plasma reactor singing hymns in binary and light, its containment field woven through with patterns of purple and blue that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. Vin Sigma stood before it with his mechadendrites extended, and I realized he was no longer controlling the machinery but communing with it. His consciousness merged with the ship's systems in a gestalt that transcended both flesh and metal. "We are becoming one system," he said without turning. "Ship, crew, warp stuff, the distinctions are dissolving. I can feel every soul aboard as clearly as I feel my own components. The enduring resolve is evolving into a form that exists simultaneously in materium and immaterium, a hybrid entity that serves as bridge between states of being. Will we survive it? We already have. The question is what we will be when the transformation completes." I left him there and descended deeper into the ship's structure, following instinct more than maps because maps no longer held meaning. I found chambers that couldn't exist within the hull's physical dimensions, vast spaces that stretched for kilometers inside a vessel that measured only 3 from bow to stern. I found crew members who had merged partially with bulkheads, their bodies extending into the metal while their minds remained conscious and aware, and they greeted me calmly as if this was natural, as if becoming part of the ship was simply the next stage of duty. I found the missing crew. They stood in a chamber that existed somewhere beneath the keel and above the highest deck simultaneously, 53 souls arranged in concentric circles around a pillar of light that burned without heat. They had not disappeared, they had been drawn to this place by something in the ship or the warp, drawn to serve as anchors for the transformation, living conduits that channeled energy between dimensions. Their eyes reflected the pillar's light, and when they spoke it was in unison, their voices merged into a single harmonic. "Captain," they said, "we volunteered." I gave no such order. The ship asked. We answered. Someone must hold the pattern while reality reorganizes. Someone must remember what we were so we can remember what we become. I wanted to pull them away, to drag them back to their posts and restore them to individuality. But I understood instinctively that doing so would collapse the transformation into chaos. They had become living prayers, and prayers required faith to endure. "Then I will hold the pattern with you," I said. I stepped into the circle and felt the pillar's energy flow through me like electricity and honey, burning and sweet, and I saw the enduring resolve as a totality, every corridor and chamber, every crew member and machine spirit, every particle of matter and wave of thought that composed our existence. I saw the warp outside, vast and incomprehensible, filled with currents and beings and structures that my mind translated into symbols because the reality was too large to perceive directly. And I saw the thread connecting us, the pattern that Cassia had tried to describe, the shape of our ship and crew carved through the immaterium like a sculpture made of duty and faith. The warp wanted that pattern. The entities watching us, I could see them now. Immense intelligences that dwelt in the space between thought and form, wanted to understand how something so small and fragile could persist in maintaining purpose, despite existing in a realm where purpose was fluid and changeable. We fascinated them. We were a puzzle, and they had drawn us deep into their domain not to destroy us but to study what made us function, to learn the secret of human will. "Show us," they whispered through the pillar. "Show us why you refuse to break." And I showed them. I opened my mind fully to the transformation and let the warp see everything: 40 years of service, every battle and decision, every moment of fear conquered and duty upheld, every prayer spoken in darkness and every order given under fire. I showed them the weight of command, the burden of 6,000 lives depending on my judgment, the pride and terror and love and grief that came with being responsible for souls who trusted me to lead them through hell. I showed them the Imperium's brutal majesty, the endless sacrifice and unwavering faith that held humanity together across 1,000,000 worlds. I showed them what it meant to serve something greater than self, to choose duty over survival, to maintain purpose in a universe that offered 1,000 justifications for despair. And the warp learned. I felt it absorb the pattern of my will, felt vast intellects parsing the structure of human loyalty and filing it away in libraries that existed outside time. I felt them understand, in whatever way such beings could understand, why I continued to fight even when fighting was irrational, why I guided my crew through transformation rather than abandoning them to dissolution. They comprehended duty the way a scholar comprehends a text intellectually, analytically, without truly feeling it, but comprehension was enough. The pillar flared bright enough to burn away vision, and I felt the Geller field reach 0% and reality unravel completely. We dissolved. Every atom of ship and crew came apart, breaking down into constituent energies that swirled through the warp like ash in a hurricane. And I should have died in that moment, should have ceased to exist as anything resembling Hadrian Voss. But the pattern held. The 53 anchors and I held the memory of what we had been, and around that memory the warp began to weave something new. I cannot describe the process except through metaphor, because it occurred in spaces where human perception had no meaning. Imagine being a sculpture remade by hands that work in dimensions your mind cannot count. Imagine every thought and memory being taken apart, examined, and reassembled in configurations that preserve meaning while altering form. Imagine dying and being reborn moment by moment. Infinite deaths and resurrections that happen simultaneously until the distinction between living and dead becomes irrelevant. The enduring resolve reformed around us, but it was no longer a ship. It was a space, a pocket realm carved into the warp's fabric, held in place by will and faith and the pattern we had shown the watching entities. The corridors existed not as metal passages but as conceptual connections between points of significance. The crew took shape not as flesh but as patterns of consciousness anchored to purpose. We had become something the Imperium had no name for, a collective entity that maintained individual awareness while existing as a single unified thought. And we could move through the warp, not navigate in the traditional sense, but will ourselves toward destinations, the ship responding to intent rather than navigation charts. We were no longer traveling through the immaterium, we were part of it, moving as native denizens rather than invaders, and the currents that would have torn us apart now carried us gently because we had ceased to be foreign matter in a hostile realm. I stood on the bridge that was no longer a bridge, surrounded by officers who were no longer entirely human, and I understood that we had survived. Transformed beyond recognition, changed in ways that would mark us as abominations if we ever returned to the Imperium, but survived. The crew lived, the ship persisted, purpose remained. "Navigator," I said, and Cassia's pattern responded, her third eye now permanently open, and seeing truths she no longer feared. "Find Metallica. Find any Imperial world. Find a way home." "Yes, Captain," she said, and her voice carried harmonics of a dozen other crew members who had merged partially with her consciousness. "I see the way now. We can reach the Materium, but Captain, we may not be welcomed when we arrive. Then we'll face that judgment when it comes. For now, set course and engage." The enduring resolve that was no longer quite a ship moved through the warp that was no longer quite external to us, and I felt us accelerate toward distant stars, guided by purpose that had outlived flesh and steel. We moved through the warp for what might have been days or centuries, and time ceased to be a measurement I could trust or care about, because we existed now in a state where duration meant nothing and everything simultaneously. The crew adjusted to their new forms with varying degrees of success. Some embraced the transformation, their consciousness expanding to fill spaces they had never imagined possible, their duties evolving from maintenance and operation to something closer to meditation, holding the ship's pattern stable through force of concentrated will. Others struggled, clinging to memories of flesh and solidity, their patterns flickering with instability until we learned to support them, surrounding them with the collective consciousness of the crew until they remembered who they had been and accepted what they had become. I found I could perceive all of them simultaneously now, 6,000 points of light arranged in the complex geometry of our shared existence, and I knew each one by name and purpose, and the particular frequency of thought that defined their individuality. Morven burned steady and blue, his loyalty transformed into something like gravity that helped anchor the rest of us. Harrick radiated patterns of structure and discipline, his consciousness forming lattices that others could use as templates for maintaining order. Even Cassia, broken and remade, now shone with a clarity she had never possessed before, her navigator's gift amplified by transformation into something that could read the warp's currents as easily as I once read tactical displays. Veen Sigma had merged almost completely with the ship's systems, his consciousness distributed through every circuit and conduit, and he spoke rarely now, but when he did, his words carried the authority of the enduring resolve itself. He was the ship, and the ship was him, and I understood that this was perhaps the Omnissiah's true blessing, not protection from the warp, but evolution into forms that could master it. We encountered other things in the depths of the Imperium, entities that ranged from vast and terrible to small and curious, and I learned to navigate their presence the way I had once navigated void combat. Some were hostile, pressing against our boundaries with claws made of madness and hunger, and we defended ourselves not with weapons but with the sheer clarity of our purpose, projecting our pattern outward with enough force to repel them. Others were simply alien, existing in states so different from our own that communication was impossible, and we altered our course to avoid them. A few appeared to recognize what we had become, and I felt something like respect emanate from them, acknowledgement that we had achieved a transformation they had not expected creatures of the Imperium to accomplish. The watching eyes remained, the vast intelligences that had drawn us into this transformation, and I understood now that they were servants of something called the Architect of Fate by those who named such things, entities that existed to observe change and catalogue its infinite variations. We had shown them a pattern. They valued human will, maintaining structure despite dissolution, and they had preserved us as one preserves a specimen, keeping us stable through the transformation because we represented data worth studying. They watched us still, and I felt no malice in their attention, only clinical interest and perhaps something approaching approval. I should have hated them for what they had done to us. I should have raged against the violation of being remade without consent, against the loss of flesh and the corruption of form that would mark us as heretics if any Imperial authority learned of our existence. But I couldn't muster that rage, because they had also given us something precious: survival. We lived when we should have dissolved. We persisted when we should have been unmade. And we remained loyal to the Imperium despite existing in a form the Imperium would never accept. That paradox occupied much of my thought during our journey through the warp's depths. We had maintained our purpose through transformation, had held to duty even as every physical and metaphysical aspect of our being changed, and yet that very transformation made us anathema to the Imperium we served. We could not return unchanged. We could not explain what we had become without inviting immediate purging. Our survival guaranteed our exile. I convened my officers in the space that served as our bridge, our consciousnesses merging into a shared gestalt where thought flowed without words, and I laid the problem before them without pretense or comfort. We had achieved the impossible. We had adapted to the warp and survived, but surviving made us monsters in the eyes of those we had sworn to protect. Metallica was close now. Cassia's enhanced senses could feel the Imperium boundary approaching, could perceive the thin places where we might force our way back into real space. But if we returned, we would be destroyed. The Inquisition would declare us corrupt. The Mechanicus would dismantle us for study. The Navy would mark the enduring resolve as a lost ship, its crew assumed dead, and any attempt to prove otherwise would only confirm our corruption. Morven's pattern pulsed with sorrow and acceptance. We could not go home. We had known this since the moment we felt the transformation take hold, but acknowledging it now, so close to real space, carried a grief that burned through our shared consciousness like acid. Harrick suggested we continue in the warp, use our new abilities to serve the Imperium from the shadows, emerge only when and where we were needed most. Become ghosts, legends, a ship that appeared in moments of desperate need and vanished before anyone could question what they had seen. Torvus proposed we seek out other lost ships, other crews trapped in the warp's depths, and guide them through the transformation we had survived. Become shepherds for the damned, preserving Imperial lives even in forms the Imperium would never acknowledge. Cassia's vision stretched furthest. She saw futures where we became something entirely new, a bridge between the Imperium and the Warp's strange territories, ambassadors capable of moving through both realms and preventing others from suffering what we had suffered. I listened to each proposal, feeling the weight of them settle into our collective consciousness, and I understood that all of them were possible, and none of them were certain. We had been transformed into beings of pure potential, and the Warp had given us the terrible gift of choice. We could become anything we had the will to manifest. "We will do all of it," I finally said, my thought resonating through the gestalt with the authority of command that had survived transformation intact. "We will serve the Imperium from darkness. We will guide lost ships when we can. We will become the bridge between realms if such a bridge can exist. But above all, we will maintain our purpose. We are still the enduring resolve. We still serve the Emperor. That truth anchors us, and as long as we hold to it, we remain his servants, regardless of what form we wear." The crew's collective consciousness surged with acceptance, with relief, with determination that burned bright enough to illuminate the Warp around us. We had found our purpose anew, had redefined duty in terms that transcended flesh and steel, and in that moment I felt something I had not felt since the transformation began: hope. We approached the Materium boundary with ceremonial slowness, the ship that was no longer quite a ship making its way toward the thin places where realities touched. I felt real space on the other side of the membrane, felt the solid predictability of physical law and the comforting weight of three-dimensional existence, and part of me ached to return, to feel gravity and breathe air and walk corridors that obeyed the rules of architecture. But I knew we could not stay there. We existed now in the liminal spaces between states, and returning fully to the Materium would collapse the pattern we had become. Cassia guided us to a weak point near Metallica's system, a place where the Geller field of a passing ship had worn the boundary thin, and we pushed through with gentle insistence. Reality resisted our passage. We were foreign matter trying to enter a space that recognized us as no longer quite real, but the force of our collective will was enough. We emerged into real space for brief seconds, materializing long enough to broadcast our final transmission. I spoke alone for that message, my consciousness compressing itself back into something approximating individual human perception, and I forced my pattern to generate sound waves in the frequencies of Gothic speech. The message was simple, delivered on all Imperial frequencies, marked with identification codes that proved we were who we claimed to be. "This is Captain Hadrian Voss of the Enduring Resolve. We are lost no longer, we have endured. Tell Metallica their munitions will be delivered by another ship. Tell the Imperium we continue to serve. Tell the Emperor we remain loyal." Then we withdrew, slipping back through the membrane into the Warp before any response could reach us, before scanning equipment could analyze what we had become, before anyone could mark our position and send inquisitors to investigate. We drifted in the Warp's currents, holding position just beyond the boundary, and I felt the crew settle into their new existence with quiet acceptance. This was home now. The Immaterium with all its madness and beauty and incomprehensible vastness. We would learn its patterns. We would master its currents. We would become what no other Imperial vessel had achieved, a permanent presence in the realm that devoured all others who entered it. I dispersed from the bridge space and moved through the ship's conceptual corridors, my consciousness touching each crew member in turn, confirming their stability, their purpose, their continued loyalty. They greeted me with thoughts of gratitude and determination, and I felt their absolute trust despite everything we had been through, despite everything I had led them into. They still followed, they still believed, and I would guard that trust with every fragment of will I possessed. In what had been my quarters, I found the shrine still existed not as physical matter but as a constellation of memory and faith, the pattern of devotion preserved through transformation. I knelt before it in the way consciousness can kneel, and I prayed not with words but with the fundamental vibration of my being, offering up gratitude for survival and strength, for what lay ahead and apology for the price we had paid. The watching eyes remained distant now, their curiosity satisfied, their study complete. They had learned what they wanted from us and moved on to other patterns, other transformations. But I knew they would return occasionally to observe, to note how we evolved in our new state, to catalogue the long-term results of their experiment. I accepted their attention. They had given us life when death should have claimed us, and if the price was being observed, then observation was a debt I would pay willingly. The enduring resolve drifted in the spaces between, held in place by will and purpose and the unbreakable bond of a crew that had survived the unsurvivable. We were no longer ship and sailors, but something new, something that had no name in Imperial taxonomies, something that would serve the Emperor from shadows that no light could pierce. I felt time begin to flow again in rhythms I could understand. Felt the crew settle into routines of maintaining our pattern and watching for ships that might need guidance. We had become sentinels of the warp, guardians posted at the edge of madness to ensure others would not fall as we had fallen, or if they fell, that they might land as softly as we had landed. The lights no longer bowed. They were us now, and we burned steady in the darkness. I am Captain Hadrian Voss, and I remain on station in depths no chart records, forever loyal to an Imperium that will never know I endure.